I am the man who painted the line. That's the simplest way I know to start, and it's the truest. Out on the long stretch of state highway that runs north from the reservoir up into the cattle country, there's about a 4-mile section where the centerline does something it shouldn't, where it drifts off the crown of the road and runs out into the borrow ditch and just stops in the grass. And people who drive it at night still ease over toward it without knowing why. The way you lean toward any line somebody painted to tell you where to go. I painted that line. I did it on purpose, in the dark, with a hand can and a steady arm. While a thing I still cannot name correctly came up the road behind my crew. So before I tell you anything else, understand that I'm not a bystander to this. I am a contractor. I built part of the trap knowingly, and 3 men are gone because the line I painted said this way is safe. My name is Cal Doyle, and I ran a striping crew for the state's roadway maintenance contractor for 19 years. Pavement marking, we call it. Most people never think about it for a single second of their lives, which is exactly how you know we did it right. The line on the road is the most trusted thing in the world, and nobody knows it. You drive 90 miles an hour at midnight with your family asleep in the car, and you put all of it, every life in that vehicle, on the faith that the yellow line is where somebody competent said it should be. It isn't a suggestion. It's a contract between the man who painted it and the stranger who follows it. And the stranger never knows your name and never will. And that anonymity is the whole dignity of the work. You keep them between the lines, and they get home and they never once think of you. 19 years I held up my end of that. A striping operation isn't one truck. It's a convoy. And I want you to see it because the shape of it matters later. Up front, you've got a pilot vehicle. Then the striper itself, which is a big slow rig with the paint tanks and the bead tanks and the spray guns hanging off the side on a carriage. A man riding the carriage to watch the guns. A driver up top steering off a sight pointer that hangs out over the existing line. Behind the striper, you run a shadow vehicle and then the crashed truck. The big one with the impact attenuator on the back, the giant yellow arrow board. The thing whose entire job is to be the vehicle that gets hit so the men don't. We move at maybe 7, 8 miles an hour laying long line. A whole crew strung out over a few hundred feet of open road going slow at night. Because you stripe at night when the traffic's thin and the paint can cure without somebody driving through it. Cones, signs, flaggers if we need them. A little traveling town of working men, lit up, crawling north through the dark. And everything about how we're set up, every cone and light and truck, is designed around one belief, which is that the danger comes from the traffic, from other people, from a drunk or a sleeper drifting into the work zone. That's the only threat the whole system is built to survive. We had no procedure for the road itself being the thing that was wrong. I took the cattle country job because it paid a premium and because I needed the money and the distance both. My brother Wade had died 8 months before. He was my younger brother, and he'd driven for me, on and off, for years. The crashed truck mostly, the dangerous seat. Because somebody you trust has to ride the truck whose job is to be hit. And I trusted Wade more than I trusted my own hands. And then one night, on a job 2 counties over, not even a bad night, an ordinary night, a pickup came through our taper at speed and hit the crashed truck. And Wade was in it. And the truck did its job. The attenuator did its job. It crushed the way it's built to crush to save the man. And it saved the driver of the pickup. And it did not save Wade. The attenuator is rated for impacts up to a certain speed. The pickup was over it. There's a number, and the number was exceeded, and that's the whole story in the report. Impact exceeded design parameters. I read that line 100 times. my brother reduced to a parameter that got exceeded. I kept working because stopping felt like agreeing that the work had killed him. And I couldn't agree to that. The work was clean, the work was good. It was the world that came through the taper too fast. So I took the long cattle country contract that put me 4 hours from home and from his widow and from my own kitchen where I kept seeing him at the table, and I told myself the distance was about the per diem. It wasn't. I was running. A man who has spent his life keeping strangers safe between two lines will, when his own brother dies in the seat, go looking for more line to paint, because it's the only thing he knows how to control. That's the wound. Hold on to it. It's the reason I trusted the line longer than any sane man should have. The contract was to restripe that north highway from the reservoir up to the county line. About 31 miles, 3 weeks of night work. And the strange thing about it, I noticed the first night and filed under nothing. The plans were old. Every striping job comes with a marked up set of plans, the as-builts, that show you the existing layout, the lane widths, the no passing zones, where the line goes solid and where it breaks. And these as-builts were decades out of date, and somebody at the agency had hand-corrected them in pencil. Recently, you could tell. The graphite still bright. The printed plans showed the highway ending at the reservoir, just stopping. A dead end at the water, the way it apparently had been built originally, back when the reservoir was the edge of everything. And then the pencil had drawn the road continuing north up into the cattle country. 31 miles of road that the official prints insisted did not exist. Sketched in by hand by somebody who clearly knew it was there because we were standing on it. I asked the agency inspector about it, a thin, tired man named Petrie, who met us at the staging yard the first night with the permits. I held up the prints and I said, "Your plans show this road ending at the water." And he looked at it for a second and he said, "Flat. Prints are old. Road got extended. Just stripe what's under your sight pointer and don't worry about the paper." Which is a completely normal thing for an inspector to say. Stripe what's there. The line goes where the road goes. I didn't worry about the paper. But I'll tell you the thing that stuck, the small wrong note, because it's the first one. Petrie wouldn't drive past the reservoir. He worked with us the first few nights down on the south end, the part the prints knew about. And he was fine, professional, signed our daily reports. And the night we moved the operation north of the water, up onto the part of the road that wasn't on the prints, Petrie stayed behind. Said he'd inspect the north section by daylight. State inspectors do not work days when the crew works nights. It doubles their hours. It's not done. But he did it. He inspected our night work in the daytime after we'd gone to the motel for the entire northern stretch. And I never once saw that man on the road north of the reservoir in the dark. I thought he was lazy. I thought he was milking the overtime. I was wrong about why, but I was right that it meant something. The first anomaly that I couldn't fully file away came in the second week, and it came through the paint, which is the part nobody would understand but me. So let me explain it. When you lay a long line over an existing line, you run off a sight pointer, a little gun sight that hangs out over the old stripe, and the driver up top keeps the crosshair on the old line, and the guns lay the new paint right on top. It's a tracking job. You follow what's already there. And on the northern stretch, the part not on the prints, the old line I was following started to disagree with the road, just slightly. The crown of the road, the high center of it where the centerline belongs, would be in one place, and the old painted line I was tracking would drift a few inches, then a foot, off the crown, out toward the shoulder, and then come back. As if whoever had painted it last had been following something other than the road. I'd never seen old line do that. Old line is laid on the crown because that's where the line goes. This old line wandered, gently, like it was following a path the road didn't quite agree with. And my guns followed it because that's the job. You track the existing line. And so I spent 3 nights faithfully repainting somebody else's drift, making it fresh and bright and authoritative. A wandering line made suddenly trustworthy by new paint. I should have stopped and shot a survey. I should have called it in. Instead, I did the thing I always do, the thing that is the center of me. I trusted the line. The old line was there. Somebody competent had laid it. My job was to honor it, not to second-guess it. The line is a contract. You don't break the contract because the road feels off under your wheels. I told my up-top man, a steady older guy named Reyes, just track the old line, don't fight it. And he did. And I see now that I taught my own crew to follow the wandering thing because I could not let myself believe that a painted line could be lying. The personal thing came that same week. Wade's widow, Sheila, called me one night during our dinner break, which we took around 2 a.m. at a turnout. And she was crying, not hard, just the worn-out crying of somebody 8 months in. And she said she'd been going through Wade's things, and she'd found his old work log, the little notebook he kept. Drivers keep them, hours and miles, and notes. And she said there was an entry in it from years back, from a job up in this same cattle country, a job I didn't even remember us doing. And the entry just said, in Wade's handwriting, north of the reservation, don't follow the old line up here. Tell Cal. Tell Cal. And she'd been sitting with it for days, not knowing what it meant or whether to bother me with it. A dead man's note to me about a road. And finally, she'd called. And I stood at that turnout, with the phone to my ear, and the striper ticking as it cooled, and the dark cattle country all around us, on the exact road the note was about, repainting the exact old line the note said not to follow. And I told her it was probably nothing, just Wade noting a bad stretch. You know how he was about his lines. I told my brother's widow it was nothing. And then I went back and finished the shift, tracking the old line north, because the alternative was to take seriously a warning from a man I'd failed to keep alive. And I could not do that because if Wade's warnings were worth heeding, then so was the one part of me that had known, the night he climbed into the crash truck, that we were a man short on rest and should have stood down. And I had not stood us down. And he had died. And I had spent 8 months not letting myself finish that thought. So I called it nothing. I made it nothing. I was very practiced by then, at making the warnings of dead men into nothing. The contradiction between the official picture and the road got concrete in the 3rd week. And it was a small thing made of paper, and it chilled me worse than anything physical had. Our crew foreman did the daily reports, the as-built red lines, marking up the prints with what we'd actually striped each night, station to station, so the agency has a record. Standard. And one morning before we knocked off, the foreman, a younger guy named Bisbee, came to me confused, and he showed me the running total. We measure our progress by stationing, surveyor stations, 100-foot increments, and you log your start station and end station each night. And it should add up clean. Last night's end is tonight's start. The numbers march north in order. And Bisbee's numbers didn't march. Every night we logged 8-9 miles of stationing laid. We'd been at it 11 nights north of the reservoir. By the stationing, by our own honest nightly logs, we had striped something like 90 miles of road north of the water. And the road from the reservoir to the county line was 31. We had laid 3 times more line than the road was long. Every night's log honest and signed. And the county line was still somewhere ahead of us in the dark, no closer than it had been a week ago. And the reservoir behind us, when we drove back to the motel each dawn, was always exactly the same 40 minutes back, never more, no matter how many miles of line we'd laid going north. Bisbee thought it was a measurement error. He wanted to recalibrate the distance counter on the striper, and I let him, because a measurement error is a thing a man can fix with a wrench in the morning. And the other explanation, the one where the road north of the reservoir was longer on the inside than the outside, where 11 nights of honest northward work had not gotten us 1 mile closer to the end of a 31-mile road. That explanation had no wrench. So we recalibrated the counter. It read true on the test run. And the next night, we laid 9 more miles of line, and the county line was no closer. And the reservoir was still 40 minutes back. And I stopped letting Bisbee do the math out loud, where the crew could hear it, which was the first genuinely bad thing I did. The first time I chose to manage the crew's calm over telling them the truth. And I've learned since that this is always the first bad thing, the choosing of calm, and that all the worst things grow out of it. The first real system failure, the one that took it out of the realm of paperwork and bad feelings, happened on the 4th weeknight, and it was the radios, but not the way you'd think. Our crew ran on simple 2-way radios, truck to truck, short range, the pilot up front talking to the striper, talking to the crashed truck in back. Constant, easy chatter, the normal noise of a crew working a line at night. And that night, the chatter started to lag. You'd key up and say something to the crashed truck, and the answer would come back a beat too slow, then 2 beats. Then you'd say a thing, and get back. From the truck 300 feet behind you, a piece of something you'd said 10 minutes earlier, your own crew's voices coming back out of order, delayed, the way the line itself had drifted, as if the distance between our trucks was getting longer than the few hundred feet we could plainly see it was. I could look back down the road and see the crashed truck's arrow board, right there, close, and key the radio and hear Reyes's voice arrive from it like he was calling from miles off, slow and stretched. The trucks were close. The voices came from far away. And I understood, standing on the carriage of my own striper with a paint gun in my hand, that the road we were on had a length the eye could not see, that we were strung out across more distance than the space between our trucks, that the convoy I'd run for 19 years, the little traveling town, had been quietly pulled apart along a road that was longer in the dark than it was in the headlights, and that the cones and the signs and the crashed truck, every part of the system I trusted to keep my men together and safe, were built for a road that stayed the length it looked, and this one didn't. And there was no procedure for that, none. In 19 years, I had never been handed a single page that told a striping foreman what to do when the road behind his own crash truck became too long to reach. I called a stop. That's worth saying because it's the one time in the whole job I overrode the line instead of trusting it. And even then I did it for the wrong reason. I did it because the radio scared me, a thing I understood, and not because of the math or the drift or Wade's note, things I refused to understand. I keyed up and told the convoy to hold, shut down the guns, regroup, and I walked back along our fresh, wet line toward the crash truck to put my eyes on my men, because the voices coming from it had gotten so slow and far that I needed to see Reyes's face and prove the distance was a trick of the radio and not a trick of the road. It was a long walk. That's the thing I keep coming back to. The crashed truck's arrow board was right there. I could see every amber bulb of it. I could read the lettering, and I walked toward it at a normal pace along my own fresh stripe. And it did not get closer the way a thing that close should. I walked for what my legs told me was a quarter mile toward a truck that my eyes told me was 300 feet away. And the fresh paint under my boots went on and on. My night's work, more of it than I'd laid. And the cattle country on both sides was that flat black nothing. No lights, no fences I could make out. No cattle, no anything. just the road and the line, and the two ends of my convoy hung impossibly far apart in the dark. And I understood walking it that the road wasn't long the way miles are long. It was long the way a hallway is long, in the kind of dream where you run and the door stays where it is. The distance wasn't in the ground. It was in the going. I reached the crash truck eventually. Reyes was in it, and he was fine, and he was wrong, and both of those were true at once. He was sitting in the cab with his hands on the wheel, staring straight ahead up the road. And when I knocked on the glass, he turned and looked at me, and it took him a second too long to know me, and he rolled the window down, and he said, "Cal, you walked all the way back?" Like I'd done something strange. And I said, "The radios are lagging. I came to check on you." And he nodded slow, and he said, Yeah. The line's good, though. You laid a good line tonight. Long, but good." And there was something flattened in how he said it. A man reciting the comfort of the work. The line is good. The same comfort I'd been reaching for all job. And hearing it come back at me out of Reyes's mouth in that flat tone was the first time I felt the cold all the way down. Because I knew that tone. It was Petrie's tone, telling me not to worry about the paper. It was the tone of a man who had decided to follow the line, because the alternative was to look at where it was actually going. The reveal didn't come as a single thing. It came the way the distance came, by accumulation, until I was standing in the middle of it. I had Reyes drive the crash truck up to regroup with the rest of the convoy. And on the way, he passed something on the shoulder and slowed. And I was walking alongside, and I saw it too. It was a striper. An old one. A rig like ours, but decades older, pulled off on the shoulder, paint long gone to rust, tires flat to the rims, sitting there in the borrowed ditch where the wandering old line ran out into the grass. And it had a crash truck behind it, also rusted, also dead, an arrow board with no bulbs left, and a pilot vehicle ahead. The whole convoy, a whole striping operation like mine, pulled off and abandoned on the shoulder of a road that wasn't on the prints, rusted into the ground. And I knew without being able to prove it that this was the crew that had laid the old line I'd been faithfully repainting all job. The wandering line, the line that drifted off the crown. They'd laid it. And here they were, their whole little traveling town, stopped forever on the shoulder. And the line they painted ran on north into the dark past them. And I had been following it, freshening it, making it bright and trustworthy again. The last honest line of a crew that had driven north on this road and never come back, and whose final work was a center line that drifted gently off the road and out toward the grass, because by the end they had been following something that was not the road. And then I understood Petrie, the inspector who wouldn't come north of the water in the dark, who inspected our night work by day. He wasn't lazy and he wasn't milking overtime. He knew. The pencil corrections on the prints, the road sketched in by hand past the dead end at the reservoir, the road the official drawings refused to print. Somebody at that agency knew this stretch was here and knew what it did, and had a man whose job was to permit crews onto it and never, ever drive it in the dark himself. The prints showed the road ending at the water because in every sense that mattered, the real road, the road that took you home, did end at the water. What ran north of the reservoir was something the maps were right to leave off. And they hired it striped anyway. Fresh line laid on the old drifting line, year after year, crew after crew. A contract renewed forever. And I finally understood what the contract actually was. It wasn't to maintain a road. It was to keep the line painted. Because the line is the most trusted thing in the world, and nobody knows it. And as long as the line up here stayed fresh and bright and authoritative, Anyone who wandered onto this road in the dark would do the thing every driver does. The thing I had built my whole life on. They would trust the line, they would follow it, they would lean toward it, and it would take them north, gently, off the crown of the world, and out into the grass where the stripers go to rust. We weren't maintaining the road, we were baiting it. And the bait was the one thing I had spent 19 years making the most trustworthy object a human being can follow. I want to tell you. I gathered my crew and turned us south the second I understood. I didn't, and the why of it is the wound. So I'll give it to you straight. When I understood what the line was, the first thing I felt under the horror, in the same breath as the horror, was that Wade had been right. North of the res, don't follow the old line. Tell Cal. He'd known. He'd been up here, years ago, on a job I couldn't even remember, and he'd seen enough to write it down. And he'd died before he ever told me, and his widow had carried the note to me on this exact road, and I had said it was nothing. And standing by that rusted convoy, I had a choice that wasn't really about survival yet. It was about which I could bear. And I'm ashamed of how the scale tipped, because turning south meant Wade had been right, and I had been wrong. Not just here, but everywhere. About the line, about the contract, about the whole faith I'd organized my life around. And worst of all, it meant that a man's instinct, a man's bad feeling, was worth more than the painted line, which meant my bad feeling the night Wade climbed into the crash truck had been worth more than the schedule I kept us on. And I had ignored it, and he had died. To turn south was to admit all of that at once. And so, for one more shift, God help me, I told myself I needed to be sure. I told the crew the abandoned rig was just a derelict, equipment somebody walked away from, nothing to do with us. And I had us mount back up and lay more line, north, because I was not yet able to be the man who trusts the feeling over the line. I needed proof a fool couldn't argue with. I went looking for it instead of turning around. And the road, which had all the time in the world, gave it to me. We laid line for another hour, and the road changed. Not dramatically. The cattle country on the side started to go wrong in small ways, the grass too tall and too still in no wind. And then there were fences again, but the fence posts were leaning all the same direction like something had pushed past them going north. And then the old line under my sight pointer stopped drifting gently and started to leave the road in earnest, swinging out toward the right shoulder, toward the black grass. And I had to make a real decision with my guns in real time, the decision I'd been avoiding the whole job. Track the old line, which was now plainly leaving the road, or hold the crown and let the old line go. And 19 years and a dead brother's faith all came down on the side of the line. I held the crosshair on the old stripe. I followed it off the crown. I laid bright new paint out toward the grass, because the old line went there, and the old line was the contract. And I watched my own fresh stripe leave the road under my guns, and I could not make my hands hold the crown. That's the truth of what kind of man the work had made me. At the actual moment, with the road right there to follow, I followed the painted lie instead, because I had spent my life teaching myself that the lie was the one thing you never doubt. It was Bisbee who broke it. Young Bisbee with his stationing math. The one who'd wanted a wrench for everything. He came up on the radio, and his voice didn't lag. It came through clear and close and scared, and he said, "Cal, the pilot truck's gone. Up front. Hendry was a quarter-mile ahead, and his lights just aren't there anymore. He's not answering." Hendry ran our pilot vehicle. The lead, the man who drove out ahead into the dark, to be our eyes. And I looked north, up the road past my striper. And Bisbee was right. The pilot's taillights that should have been up there were gone. And on the radio, there was nothing from Henry. Not lag, not static. Just the particular silence of a channel with nobody on the other end. The same silence I knew from a cemetery I'd never worked, but somehow recognized in my bones. The silence of help that isn't coming. Henry had driven north, following the line ahead of us, into the part of the road where the line left the crown for good. And the road had simply taken the front of my convoy, the way it had taken every convoy before mine. From the front, quietly, one set of taillights at a time, while the rest of us followed the bright, fresh line we'd been laying right behind him. That was the proof a fool couldn't argue with. It cost a man. Henry, who had a wife and a kid he showed us pictures of at the 2 a.m. turnouts. Henry was the price of me needing to be sure. And I will carry that. The knowing that a quicker, humbler man, a man who could have believed Wade's note, would have turned us south an hour earlier, and Henry would have driven home. I needed proof, and the road billed me a man for it. Now I'll tell you the survival choice, the real one, the one I make myself say out loud. When Henry's lights went out, I finally turned us around. And turning a striping convoy on a 2-lane road is slow. It's a whole maneuver. Trucks and cones and 3-point turns in the dark. And the whole time we did it, the road was getting longer behind us, south, the way it had gotten longer north. The reservoir that had always been 40 minutes back now, somewhere far off in a dark that was stretching to keep us. And I understood, getting us pointed south, that the road didn't care which way you drove. It made distance in whatever direction you needed to go. The line going north led you out into the grass, but going south didn't shrink the road back to 31 miles. It just gave you more road, more dark, more line to follow. And somewhere out ahead of us in the southbound dark, the line would start to drift off the crown too, because the road was the same in both directions. It only ever did the one thing. It grew, and it baited, and it ate from the front. So here's what I did. I had us drive south, fast, no striping now, just running for the reservoir. And the road grew, and the line in our headlights was my own fresh paint. The line I'd laid coming north, bright and trustworthy and mine. And I watched it, and I saw it start ahead of us in the southbound lanes, to drift off the crown. My own line, the fresh paint I'd put down going north, doing the thing the old line did, wandering toward the grass, because it had been on this road long enough now to belong to it. And the crew, my men, in the trucks behind me, would follow it, because it was a good line, because I'd taught them to track the line, because the line is the contract. And I knew that if we followed my own fresh paint south, it would do to us going home what the old line did to everyone going north. It would ease us off the crown, gently, out into the grass, into the place where the stripers rust. And I made the choice. I got out of the striper at speed, slowed it, stopped the convoy on that growing southbound road. And I took a hand can of paint, the kind you carry for touch-ups. And I walked out ahead of my own trucks into the dark. And I painted a new line, not on the crown. I didn't trust the crown anymore either. I didn't trust anything the road offered. I painted a line that I made up, out of nothing, off my own judgment. A line that ignored the old paint, and ignored the new paint, and ignored the wandering, and just held what felt in my body, in the part of Wade that I'd buried, like the way home. I painted against the line. 19 years of contract, of you follow what's painted, of never doubt the stripe. And I broke it. I laid down a line that contradicted every line already on that road. And I keyed the radio, and I told my crew, follow my fresh can, not the long line, not the old line. Ignore everything but the can I'm walking ahead of you. trust me over the paint that's already down. Which is the one thing I'd spent my whole life telling strangers never to do. And here's the part that is the punishment. The part that makes survival the burden and not the gift. Reyes wouldn't. Reyes in the crash truck, the dangerous seat, my best man. The one I trusted the way I'd trusted Wade. He came up on the radio, slow, flat, that Petrie tone. And he said, "Cal, I'm gonna stay on the long line. The long line's good. You laid a good line tonight." He had decided. Somewhere back at that rusted convoy or before, he had become a man who followed the line because the alternative, the thing I was asking, to trust a man walking ahead with a can over the painted authority of the road, was more than he could do. It was more than Petrie could do. It was more than the dead crews could do. All of them. Every striper rusting north of the water. Every one of them a crew that had followed the line, because following the line is the deepest faith a roadman has. And I was asking my own crew to commit apostasy in the dark, with something eating the convoy from the front. And Reyes couldn't, and I couldn't make him. And I had a choice to make about whether to stop the whole convoy and fight him out of that truck, or to lead out the men who would follow me and leave the man who wouldn't. I led out the ones who'd follow. Bisbee came, and 2 others. We walked south behind my hand can, me painting a made-up line, one slow can width at a time, the road fighting me, growing, the old paint and my own old fresh paint both pulling toward the grass on either side of the false true line I was laying. And behind us, Reyes turned the crash truck and drove north. The wrong way. Back up the long line, the good line, into the dark where Hendry's lights had gone out. Following the most trusted thing in the world to the place it was built to take him. And on the radio, his voice got slower and farther and flatter. "You laid a good line, Cal. Good line. Until the channel went to that silence. And I kept painting. And I did not go after him. Because going after him meant trusting the long line into the north. And I had just bet 4 men's lives on the opposite. And you cannot do both. You cannot trust the line and break it in the same night. And I had chosen to break it. And the cost of breaking it was the man I trusted most driving away from me up a perfect line. We reached the reservoir at dawn. I want to be careful here because this is where a story comforts you, and I won't. We came down off the cattle country onto the part of the road the prince knew about, the part that ends at the water, and the road stopped growing. And the line in the daylight ran true on the crown, the way line is supposed to. And there was Petrie, the inspector, parked at the staging yard in the early light. And he looked at the 3 trucks coming south, where I should have had 6. And he did not look surprised. He looked tired. He looked like a man getting a number he'd been waiting for. And he took my daily report, and he signed it, and he wrote in the box for remarks, in his small pencil hand, "North section, striping discontinued." And he never asked me about Hendry or Reyes or the others by name. And I understood that there would be no report that said what happened, that the agency had a road off its own prints and a contract that kept the line painted and an inspector who signed the dailies in daylight and counted the trucks that came back, and that I, Cal Doyle, was now part of that. The contractor who knew, the way Petrie was part of it, and that the next crew would get the same out-of-date prints with the road sketched in by hand, and the same instruction: stripe what's under your sight pointer, don't worry about the paper. And here is the line I painted, the one I told you about at the start, the 4-mile stretch where the centerline drifts off the crown and runs out into the borrowed ditch and stops in the grass. That's not the old crew's line. That's mine. That's the line I laid coming north. The fresh, bright, trustworthy line I made before I understood. And it's still up there, still being followed. Because nobody discontinued it. Nobody can. The line is the most trusted thing in the world. And once it's down, it does its work, whether the man who painted it meant it to or not. People still ease toward it at night. I baited that road. I made the best, brightest, most authoritative bait that road has ever had. With 19 years of skill in my hands, and it is still working every night on strangers who will never know my name. And I cannot go up there and take it off, because taking it off means driving north on the long line. And I know exactly where the long line goes. I don't paint anymore. People think it's grief. 2 brothers worth now. Wade, and then a whole crew. And I let them think it. Because the truth makes me sound like a man who's lost his mind. The truth is that I can't lay a line. I'll get the can in my hand, and I'll look at the road, and I'll think, somebody's going to follow this. All the way, with their family asleep in the car, on nothing but the faith that I put it where it's safe. And I'll think about how that faith is the deepest and most ordinary faith there is, and how something out past the reservoir learned to wear it, and my hands won't do it. The one skill I had, the one clean, useful thing, the keeping of strangers safe between 2 lines, I can't anymore, because I know now what a line can be made to do. And I know that the difference between the line that takes you home and the line that takes you out into the grass is nothing you can see in the dark. It's just the word of the man who painted it. And I am the man who painted both. And I followed the wrong one for 19 years and called it dignity. And I only learned to break it on the one night breaking it cost me Reyes. And I will spend the rest of my life as a striper who cannot stripe, driving roads I no longer trust, leaning like everybody else toward a line and catching myself, and pulling back to the crown by feel, by Wade's feel, the dead man's feel I should have trusted first, and never once letting the paint decide for me again in.